Alright, ladies and gentlefolk, now we're on to relationships. Not relationships of any kind of interesting interpersonal type, but rather the relationships that might exist between GDP, unemployment, and inflation. In particular, we're going to focus on unemployment and inflation. So, any economist who wants to talk about unemployment and inflation is going to talk about an economist from New Zealand named Bill Phillips, and that's a picture of him there with a machine that he built for himself, which was his macroeconomic model, trying to show how the economy functioned. Anyway, maybe we'll have a little video clip about that later. For now, what we're interested in is this. In the late 1950s, Bill Phillips decided to plot the money wage growth rate, the rate at which money wages grew, plotted that against the unemployment rate for the UK. And he did it for, I think it was from the 1860s to 1957 or something like that. Actually, I'll look it up right now. 1861. I was close. Alright, so he plotted that and he discovered the following kind of relationship. First, for 1861 to 1913, he found that there was an inverse relationship. It wasn't a particularly stable one, but it was there. But he found for 1913 to 1948, not only was there an inverse relationship, a negative relationship between the money wage growth rate and the unemployment rate, but it was also very stable. It didn't wobble around much. So this inverse relationship or negative relationship meant that if money wages grew quickly, then that was associated with very low unemployment. And when money wages grew very slowly, or even negatively, that was associated with very high unemployment. So let's look at the actual graph that Bill had printed in his 1958 paper. So if we look here, there's the Phillips curve. As you can see, the rate of change of money wage rates, when it's very high, the unemployment rate is very low. But when the unemployment rate is very high, like 22%, the change in the money wage rate is very low. In fact, it's negative in his calculations or his empirical estimations. So there appears to be this inverse or negative relationship between these two variables, which is kind of interesting. So Bill Phillips didn't have a well-developed theoretical explanation for this, although he did have one. But really the limelight was stolen in terms of theoretical explanations by these three characters. The guy here, who is looking knowingly self-satisfied, I have to say, that's Richard Lipsey from the London School of Economics. He wrote a paper in 1960, attempting to explain in part the findings by Bill Phillips. And in the same year, these two characters, Paul Samuelson and Robert Solow, got together and they wrote a paper trying to provide a further explanation for the phenomenon that Bill had mapped out. When we take the explanations of both of these two papers written by these people, we get something like the following explanation. If we start out with excess demand for labour, and let's say the excess demand for labour increases. So there's an increase in the demand for labour, and there's more demand for labour than there is supply of labour at any given moment in time. This causes the unemployment rate to, guess what, rise or fall? Well, to fall. If there's an increase in the demand for labour, then all other things being equal, the unemployment rate should fall. People who are unemployed will be absorbed into employment. Now, if the unemployment rate falls, what do you think is probably going to happen to the money wage growth rate? The rate at which money wages grow. Is it likely to go up or go down? Well, if there's fewer and fewer people unemployed, then there's two kinds of explanations one can offer. One can say that in order to entice more people into the labour market, it's necessary for employers to offer higher wages. So the money wage rate will grow. Another type of explanation is to say when the unemployment rate falls, the fear on the part of the people who are employed already, the fear of being sacked, diminishes, and so workers and unions become a bit braver and demand higher wages. In any case, by either one of those stories, the money wage rate grows. And if that happens, what happens to labour cost growth for firms? Labour cost growth will go up. You have to pay higher wages to the same workers. And finally, if labour cost growth increases, what's going to happen to the growth rate in prices of the goods which are produced? The inflation rate. It will go up. So there we go. We've got an explanation which gives us the unemployment rate going down and blah 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 blah, the inflation rate going up. And you can tell exactly the same story reversing the arrows. There's a decrease in the demand for labour, an increase in the unemployment rate, a decrease in money wage rates, a decrease in labour costs leads to a decrease in the prices of final goods, and a decrease in inflation. So you get a fall in inflation and an increase in the unemployment rate. So there's our theoretical explanation for that empirical finding by Bill Phillips. So what we end up with is a trade-off between the evils of unemployment and inflation. Especially the last two guys that we saw there, the picture of Paul Samuelson and Robert Solow. They suggested that since this relationship between the unemployment rate and the inflation rate was a relatively stable one, policymakers could think of it as providing a menu of options to choose from. So the modern Phillips curve, as drawn in textbooks today, doesn't have on the vertical axis the rate of change in money wages. Rather, it has the inflation rate. That's due to Samuelson and Solow. On the other axis, the horizontal axis, we've got the unemployment rate. So our stylized version of the modern Phillips curve has it downward sloping, like this. So we would then say that policymakers can choose between high inflation with low unemployment, or low inflation with high unemployment. It's really up to them. Then it just becomes a question of which of these two is the lesser of the two evils. Which has the lowest opportunity costs, the lowest costs for the economy as a whole? Does a high unemployment rate have ridiculously high cost for the economy as a whole compared to high inflation rate? Or is some middle ground in between, some moderate position in between with some level of inflation and some level of unemployment, is that preferred? These are the policy decisions that have to be made and have to be voted on. So, well, that's fine. What about for Australia? Is there any kind of evidence of a Phillips curve for Australia? Well, there's been oodles of research done on this topic, but I'm going to give you a little bit of an eyeball test and suggest to you that the Phillips curve manifests itself sometimes and other times not. So here's the inflation and unemployment rate data presented in a scatter plot, one against the other. Can you see something that vaguely resembles a Phillips curve there? Well, I think you can. If you put a line of, if we just did a linear regression line, a line of best fit, then you'd have something like this, which is, you know, it approximates at least the basic idea of a Phillips curve, which is that the inflation rate and the unemployment rate are inversely related. When one goes up, the other goes down. What about for the Howard years? Is there a Phillips curve there? Well, sort of. If we did a line of best fit, you can see the Phillips curve still exists. It's quite flat compared to in the Hawke years, but nonetheless, I think it's reasonable to say that there's a Phillips curve of some description there. What if we look at these guys, however? This here is the Whitlam period. Now, there's not many data points here, so we can't really say very much about it. But we can at least say there's a vaguely empirical relationship there. But it's not the one that one might be looking for if one had a Phillips curve in mind. So here we seem to have a direct relationship between the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. That is, at low levels of inflation, there's low levels of unemployment, and at high levels of inflation, there's high levels of unemployment. Not saying that there's a causal link between those two. In fact, if we want to talk in terms of causal link, we should start with unemployment. If the unemployment rate is high, then for some reason the inflation rate should be high as well. So this situation here is certainly not the norm and does not conform to the Phillips curve, or more to the point, the Phillips curve doesn't conform with it. This period was known as a period of stagflation. Stagflation because the economy was stagnating and so unemployment was high, but it also had high levels of inflation, thus stagflation. Okay, and lucky last slide, here we have data from 2007 until 2012, plotting the GDP growth rate, which is the solid line, the inflation rate, which is the dashed line, and the unemployment rate, the dotted line. So, given this data, can we say that there's a Phillips curve type relationship at work here? Well, let's start off with the GDP growth rate, because the growth rate, presumably this is our engine, which will affect the unemployment rate, and according to the Phillips curve explanation, the unemployment rate then feeds into affecting the inflation rate. So how does that go? Well, we've got from 2007 to 2009 a fairly sharp fall in economic growth. We don't have a recession because economic growth is still positive, but the growth rate has fallen substantially. Now, if the growth rate has fallen substantially, then one could presume that the growth in the demand for labour has also fallen substantially. And if that's true, then one would expect the unemployment rate to rise. And is that what we find? Well, roughly yes. If the unemployment rate rises, according to the explanation that was offered in the 1960s for the Phillips curve, unemployment is higher, wage demands are softened, so wage growth falls. And if wage growth declines, then there's less pressure on labour costs. If there's less pressure on labour cost growth, then there should be a fall in the inflation rate. Doesn't mean inflation will be negative, but there will be a fall in the rate at which prices grow. And that's what we find. We find the unemployment rate rising, and we find the inflation rate falling. What about the next period from 2009 onwards? Well, this is not so neat. We've got a slow recovery in GDP growth. This is a slow recovery in GDP growth. So it's not the speedy recovery in the same way as we had the speedy decline. The recovery is very modest, if you like. It's certainly nothing to write home about. Now, what's happening with the inflation rate and the unemployment rate then? Well, roughly speaking, the basic trend is not much. So the inflation rate, bobbed around a little bit here, but basically the overall trend is flatlining. It's stable at about 2 and something percent, 2.5%, 2.25%. And it hasn't moved off that in trend terms. Meanwhile, the unemployment rate rose to around about 5.4-ish%, 5.3%, and has hovered around that ever since. It's flatlined as well, just like the inflation rate. So, what can we say about this particular period in terms of the Phillips curve? Do we have a case of when inflation rises, we also find unemployment falling, or when the unemployment rate is high, we find the inflation rate falls? Well, not really, because we don't have changes. We don't have much by way of changes in the inflation rate and the unemployment rate. Certainly this data doesn't contradict, from 2009 on, doesn't contradict the Phillips curve, but it doesn't really confirm it either. However, we can certainly say that this period here conforms quite well to the Phillips curve. When economic growth declines, unemployment rises, there's less pressure on wages, therefore less pressure on labour costs, therefore there is less pressure on prices, and the inflation rate falls. So inflation and unemployment are inversely related, negatively related. They move in opposite directions for this period at least. So this definitely conforms to the Phillips curve.